Hi, this is Colin Sandberg for Backbone Performance. This is a presentation on the basics of power meters. It's going to be the first in a three-part series. There'll be an intermediate presentation and an advanced presentation. A little bit about me, you can read this here, I'm not going to go over. And a little bit about Backbone Performance, a few of our 2012 results. You can also check out our website at backboneperformance.com. You can check out the Facebook site, and you can check out the blog. So let's get right into it. Some gauges that we use on bicycles. Well, the original perceived exertion, how are you feeling? Could be 1 out of 10 scale, that's a traditional PE, perceived exertion scale, or the RPE scale is 6 to 20. That was designed so that it would roughly correlate to 1/10 of heart rate. Speed sensors, measuring miles per hour, kilometers per hour, cadence sensor measuring revolutions per minute, how fast you're pedaling, and of course heart rate monitors, usually done with a wireless heart rate strap measuring beats per minute, and power meters. Power meters have been around now for a little over 15 years, I believe. So we've got some experience. A lot of people have had them on their bikes for quite a while now. I think I first got a PowerTap in 2003, so it's been about 9 years now. What is a watt? Well, you can look up the physics definition of power, and you're going to see that it's force times velocity. When we apply that to a bike, we're talking about torque and RPM. Torque is how hard you're spinning. I'm sorry, torque is how hard you're pushing on the pedals, the force you're applying at any given moment, and RPM is how fast you're spinning. When we look at the physiological demand, when we talk about torque, we're talking about if you want to put out more torque, that's going to take more muscular strength. If you want to spin faster, that's going to take more leg speed. Little conversion, 746 watts is 1 horsepower. And when we talk about training with power, a lot of the descriptive use, at least, is very similar to the way you might design a workout based on pace for a runner and a swimmer. The problem is if you're running on a track or if you're swimming in a pool, there are far fewer variables that will affect your pace than when you're riding your bike on the road. So that's why. Some different types of power meters. First, you have the power taps. Those are built into the wheels, can be easily switched between two different bikes. So if you have a road bike and a time trial bike, very easy to do. The problem with that, though, is that since it is limited to that wheel, if you have a set of race wheels, you would either need to build another power tap into that for your race wheels, or what a lot of people do is they just say, I'm not going to get race data, but then you're missing out on a lot of good information. SRM, which is built into the crank, been around for a long time, longer than anything else, and of course it solves that problem because you can use any wheels. The problem with SRMs is that they're very expensive. Top level SRM will cost you about $4,000, and of course it's much more difficult to move from bike to bike. Not impossible, a lot of people do it, but certainly more difficult. You also have the Quark, which is built into, and you see that in the lower left hand corner, built into a chain ring on the crank. A lot of the same advantages of an SRM, but significantly less expensive. The problem is that some people have complained about them being difficult to calibrate or not necessarily always accurate. And the power meter that many of us are eagerly anticipating is the Garmin Vector. These are built into the pedals, be very easy to switch from bike to bike, and one thing that's really cool about these is that it measures the percentage of the power that's coming from the left and right sides. So it can be very helpful for technique for guys like me that have a strength imbalance in the two different legs, helping to even that out. But of course you are restricted to those specific pedals, which I believe that is the same platform as a Lookio, which a lot of people use, but not everybody uses, so you would be restricted to those. And of course we do not know. A few that I would not recommend, I'm not going to go into detail in each and every one of these, but upper left hand corner you see the iBike. Next to that, to the right of that, you see the polar chain tension meter. Then below the iBike there you see the ergomo, which is built into a bottom bracket. One of the problems with that is not too many people that I know of using three-piece bottom brackets or bottom bracket crank combinations anymore. And to the right of that is the new Cyclops Power Cow. All four of those are not actually reading torque. They don't have a torque sensor in there, so they're just calculating power or trying to infer power from some other measurement, whether it be airspeed or chain tension or light refraction or heart rate. And I'm not going to get into great detail, but I would just say I would want a power meter that's reliable to actually be reading torque. The last one there at the bottom is the polar pedals. You've got two main categories of power meter use, prescriptive and descriptive. In this presentation I'm really just going to be talking about prescriptive. First thing would be intervals. Doing your intervals a little bit more accurately. Avoiding junk miles. Junk miles are these some descriptive uses I'll mention quickly, and we'll go into more detail in the next presentation. You get an instant response from the power meter. If something changes, a second later, you see what changed. Tracking progress. You see that you get stronger, and you can measure this progress in a very specific quantitative way. You can identify your own strengths and weaknesses. This is mainly speaking when you're doing a race or an interval to failure, a workout to failure, should I say, something that's very intense where you're putting out a maximal effort, and you can really pinpoint maybe what led up to you getting dropped in a race, or how many intervals it took, and you can see what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then that's great data to look at and say, okay, we need to refocus your training a little bit to work on this or that. Quantifying workout stress, you can do that in a much better way with a power meter than you could just by saying workout is this many hours or this many miles, or I had this average heart rate or this average speed. Those would be ways we would typically quantify it, and each of those have their problems. Can recognize fatigue or overreaching. You can see that either the perceived exertion's up at the same power over time, or the power is down at a given heart rate or a given perceived exertion. Also, communicating with the coach, especially for athletes being coached in different areas. People that I don't see all the time can take a look at those files, tell you if you're doing your workouts right, tell you if you're improving, tell you what your strengths and weaknesses are. Doing intervals with a power meter, you get an instant response, easily customized for each individual. Might start, if we don't have test results, might start by doing that just by taking a guess based on weight, based on experience and level. Then over time we might get you in the lab, do a lactate threshold or some sort of other test, or do a field test, some sort of time trial. Anyway, we're getting specific numbers for you, specific things, so they can help you aim for those numbers during your intervals, and that's specific for each person. We can compare the power numbers, or what your power is at any given moment, to what your heart rate and perceived exertion is. Like I was saying before, it's part of it is seeing improvements over time, but part of it is seeing how your heart rate responds at a certain power, or how your perceived exertion responds. Remember, that's another response of the body, how much you're suffering. The numbers make it much more easy to compare person to person, and we can take out a lot of the things that normally might trip you up when you're trying to compare person to person. Air resistance, gravity, these things might impede your ability normally to do a workout quite right, or at least confuse you because you're going so much slower in a headwind or faster in a tailwind. Same thing with uphill and downhill. If you're using a power meter, you can take that all out of the equation. You might just say, okay, I'm doing this interval at 300 watts, and it's the same 300 watts whether you're going uphill, downhill, into a headwind, into a tailwind. And also, if you need to eat something, your power might go down at a certain exertion level, or your perceived exertion might go up. Your heart rate might change at the same power. And same thing with fatigue. So here's a couple examples. This is an interval session here. This is hill repeats. This is 8 by 3 minute hill repeats, and you can see they're all pretty tight there, aiming for a specific power. This, by the way, is from Training Peaks WKO Plus. It's a really nice training power file analysis software. I use this for analyzing all my power files. This picture here you see is from a little older version of it, but I picked this slide out from an old presentation. And what you're looking at here is time on the x-axis. Here is hill repeats in quotation marks, you see. So this is a workout where I gave the rider the same workout you saw before, but obviously much more difficult to pick out the intervals. You can't really do it at all. You may see a little bit of an attempt at the beginning. He went out way too hard. Couldn't do it. And then pretty much just did junk miles the rest of the ride. Endurance rides. Now, these are typical. If you're doing an endurance ride without a power meter, typically people go too hard up the hills, they go too easy on the downhills, they coast too much, they soft pedal too much, and very often you see them doing them with a group, of course. A lot of people look at endurance rides as just go out and ride, and that's not really true. There's much more to it, much more discipline involved, and it's very difficult to accomplish with a group. But you may not realize that without a power meter. With a power meter, much more easy to keep it steady, to spend less time coasting, less time soft pedaling, because you get an instant response there, and you quickly realize it's very difficult to do with a group. The other thing that's interesting when you have that is you can look at heart rate drift. So what you may see is that if you're keeping it a constant heart rate, your power goes down over time, maybe in the third, fourth hour of the ride. If you're keeping it a constant power, maybe your heart rate goes up. And there is a measurement on WKO Plus, PWHR, that essentially correlates these in the first and second half of a ride and compares the correlation there. So here's an example of a ride with I don't have the heart rate on here, but there's clear. So I'm not sure exactly what was happening to the heart rate, what the correlation was like. My guess is that it would be pretty level, if not going up through this ride. This is about a 3.5 hour ride that you see here, and you see how, especially after hour 2 into that third hour and beyond, that power is going significantly down. And you may not realize that. You may notice you're going a little. Time trials. Without a power meter, it's very, very easy, as most of us know, to start way too hard. And it's human nature to kind of start at a submaximal effort and go out until we hit a certain perceived exertion level. I said about 9 out of 10, but it might be different for the length of the time trial or from person to person. You kind of go out and reach a certain level of suffering that you think you can sustain, and you just stay there. But when you do that, what happens is the power goes way up in the beginning and then usually fades. And you also may not recognize when you're doing soft pedaling, when you're not pushing hard enough in the middle, at the end of the time trial, because it still hurts just as much. Heart rate and perceived exertion tend to go up very quickly and stay there, even if your power goes down. Time trials with a power meter really helps you hold back at the start, because you might be excited, and as the saying goes, everybody feels good the first few minutes. It's after that that time trials are really won and lost. So typically you would go out at the power that you think you can, the maximum power you can sustain for the duration of the time trial, or possibly just below if you're going out a little bit conservative, and then you may want to slowly bring it up if you're feeling good, if you feel like you can actually sustain a little bit more than that. Typically perceived exertion will build up to a maximal effort, but very slowly. So it may not feel like much of an effort putting out the same power at the beginning and the end, but at the end, it's really hurting. It might be everything you have just to keep it there. And typically, heart rate will slowly build to VO2 max, and of course that depends on the length of the time trial. But very often it takes about 5 or 10 minutes before your heart rate really settles in. Very important here. It's much easier to avoid those power spikes, and they can really just drain your legs if you're not careful. And if you're soft pedaling, if you're not pushing as hard, you'll see it. So this is an example of a well-paced time trial. You see the power in yellow here is pretty much flat. There's some ups and downs, as there always are, but pretty much flat, and a little bit of a raise at the end. Not much though. So that's just kind of giving it all you got, the last minute, the last 30 seconds. But what I look for, this is a poorly paced time trial. This is somebody who started too easy, too conservatively, and they bump it up significantly after a couple minutes. And then more than halfway through, they bump it up again. They can sustain that, and then you see the last minute, that looks like, about that last minute, they bump it up about 200 watts for that last minute. If you can do that at the end of a time trial, you started too easy. This is an example of somebody who started too hard in a time trial, and you just see the power fading throughout. They don't go off the end of the earth, but there's definitely some fade there. All right, so goal setting. How would you set goals? Well, a lot of people set very non-specific goals, and I always encourage my athletes to try to be as specific as possible, because at the end of the day, or the end of the season, you want to know, did you accomplish your goals or not? You can have goals by speed, but as we mentioned before, it's really affected by gravity, aerodynamics, rolling resistance, drivetrain resistance, braking force. You can compare yourself to other riders. You can have as a goal certain race results, but as we all know, in addition to all of the above factors, there's many, many other factors, weather, tactics, luck, that can help you out or hurt you. With a power meter, you can be very quantitative about these goals. You can adjust these based on body weight, looking at power to weight ratio, and that can come into play too, because you can say, well, I want to lose this much weight, but I want to maintain my power. It doesn't do you any good to lose weight if you're also losing your power. And likewise, if you are gaining a lot of weight, you're going to have to produce more and more power. So we can kind of adjust for that, normalize based on power to weight ratio. And you can adjust them based on level, category, and a specialization, meaning whether you're a sprinter or time trialist or whatever. We can get an idea of where a typical rider that you're going to be competing against will be. And this is how we might do that. This is a power profiling chart, kind of showing typical power to weight ratios or ranges for different levels of riders, everywhere from top level pros to untrained riders, men and women. And this would be the maximal power output in watts per kilogram for a given interval. The first column is 5 seconds, second is 1 minute, 5 minutes, and FT, meaning functional threshold, it would be typically 60 minutes, meaning the maximal power to weight ratio you can sustain for an hour. Just a couple things to remember here that I want to point out. First of all, heart rate, perceived exertion, speed, these things are all important. It's not just like you get a power meter and you throw out your heart rate monitor, you stop paying attention to how you feel, you don't look at how fast you're going. All of these things are important to remember. You want to be able to compare your heart rate and perceived exertion to your power numbers. You want to look at speed, because at the end of the day, it's not the guy with the highest power that wins the race, it's the fastest one. Keep your head up. A lot of people, when they first get a power meter, they're staring down at their power numbers all the time. Keep your head up, ride your bike, don't get in a crash because you're looking at your power meter. And of course, racing, doing well in racing, it's not just about having the right numbers, it's about being smart, it's about tactics, it's about how you use that power, and there's a lot of things that are much more difficult to quantify. So it's a great tool, but there's much more to racing and riding than just numbers, just power numbers. And finally, I want to mention, just because you haven't done it before doesn't mean you can't do it. A lot of people artificially limit themselves because they think that they're not capable of producing a certain amount of power because they haven't done it in the past. They know what their test results are. They know what they've done. And, you know, at the end of the day, you got to be able to go out there and... Okay, a little preview of next time when we do the intermediate power meter class. I'm going to talk a lot more about all those descriptive uses of power meters. I'm going to talk about power profiling, a little bit more explanation on the chart that I put up there. I'm going to talk about mean maximal power curves, and I'm going to go over some of the terms that we use and why they're important. Normalized power, intensity factor, or IF, training stress score, or TSS. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to send me an email or post a comment on the blog. I'd be happy to respond to it. I'll see you soon.